And hello again, and here we are back on my drive for episode 2 of my Reboot series on this, my Kawasaki Z650/1170 project. So in episode 1 I went through the bike, what's been done so far and what has to be done to get this bike finished at last. So in episode 2 I think we'll concentrate on making the rather complicated bracket to mount this rather lovely carbon fibre cockpit fairing to the bike. And so let's get started. And so they're trying to do a test fit of the fairing to the bike. What we see is that, well, it doesn't fit because these indicators get in the way. And so job 1 is to remove these indicators and relocate them somewhere else. And so the indicator's removed for the time being. Let's see how this looks when I put it against the headlamp. Hopefully we shouldn't hit any big problems. So there you go, look. How's that? So let's take this in the garage now and get out this wind and this noise, and I'll show you what I've got in mind. And so to make a start, I've decided to look at the way Kawasaki made their mount on the Z900 RS Cafe, and here's a photograph. And as you can see, it's pretty damn complicated. Now, I don't intend to try and mimic all that, and there'd be no point because the front end of my bike is completely different from that of a Z900 RS. However, I made a start by taking this 5mm rod and bending it into a suitable curve, as you can see. And hopefully these will be the start of my new mount. And so let's see how these might work on the fairing itself. And so here we have the cockpit fairing, and here we have the central boss. Got a hole here and a hole here at the top. So this long rod here will go something like that down to the central boss area where there'll be a bracket that's welded to, and then this one here will go like so. Now they're all too long, look, at this end, so it's always a good idea just to keep them over long. So I've got to make quite a complicated bracket here that these two rods can weld to. Also, it has a hole with a grommet in it that this boss can slide into, and it also has to slide onto the bolts which hold the headlamp in place with the existing brackets I've got on the bike. So this central bit's going to be quite complicated. And so here we have my two test brackets, and they'll go on here like that. Now the holes aren't quite big enough yet because they're going to have a grommet in them, which these two bosses will go into, but I think they're quite big enough to allow that. So that's kind of how they'll be. And then this part here will be shaped and cut down. It won't have a hole in it, it'll be slotted, it'll have a slot in it, so that the whole thing can be pushed onto the bolts holding on the headlamp to the headlamp brackets. Well, that's the plan anyway. And now a quick update. I've been watching a video I took earlier on, and I soon realised the headlamp was mounted far too high on the forks. So now I've lowered it back down again to where I think it should be, and I've also flipped over these two mounting brackets, and so this bit here at the top used to be at the bottom and vice versa. So now I'm hopeful that when I've got the fairing back on the bike, there's enough room here for me to drill these two brackets at the top so I can mount the indicators in just the right place in relation to the fairing. So now I'm just going to refit the lens to the headlamp, and we'll see how it looks with the fairing in place. And now, as you can see, I fitted the screen temporarily to the cockpit fairing for the first time and got it on the bike, and I must say it looks pretty damn good. So yeah, pretty happy with it so far. So let me now move the camera around and you can see how it all looks on the bike. And so there's the view front 3/4, and there's the view head on. And so now move the camera, I think you can see the big gap between this plate here, which mounts the headlamp and everything else, and the edge of the fairing. So here's my front indicator. So I want to mount it round about there, so it's in the middle of this cutout. But to do so, I've got to have a new plate which goes up, as I've already mentioned, but it also needs to project out by about this much. How far is that? I don't know, that's about 30mm, something like that. So I have to come up with some method of extending this stem by about 30mm so it ends up like that. So I'm sure we can work out a way, and it's always good to know these things before you settle on a particular design. And so now you find me just finishing off the work to make a Mark II version of these brackets I made earlier on, because the ones I made earlier on aren't quite right. I drilled a hole about 1mm out from where it should be, and so hopefully these new Mark II versions will be spot on. I'm also just back from seeing Jeff the welder, where he kindly rolled me this loop. So this aluminium loop started off life as a straight piece of rod, 8mm aluminium rod. He put it through his rollers and it turned it into this rather cool looking circle. And this loop here fits just right inside the fairing like that. And so now let me get my new brackets and this, and I'll show you how it should all work together. And now we have the Mark II brackets, which aren't quite finished yet, along with this aluminium rod that I just had rolled. So they're now sitting pretty much how they will look in the final version of the mounting bracket, except of course these brackets here will be welded to this aluminium loop. And now I'm just back from a second trip to Jeff the welder's place, where he welded up this loop and also welded on my Mark II brackets. I've checked the fitment on the cockpit fairing, it's fine. And I've checked the fitment on the bike, and it's also fine, so that's great news. What we also decided was the 5mm diameter brackets that I'd already made up aren't really man enough, you know, they're quite easy to bend, and this is 8mm. Now I could still use the 5mm for the rest of the bracketry for the cockpit fairing, but they would need quite a lot of bracing, so I didn't want to do that. But luckily, Jeff the welder had this. He had an offcut of 6mm aluminium, as you can see, aluminium rod, that we've also put through his roller to make this nice curve. Now the reason why we've done this is because when I cut it in half, I'll have two curves like this, which should be just right to be the upper mounts for the cockpit fairing, going from the centre here up to this hole here. So that's why we did that. So when I cut it in half, we should have the two. Then I've just got to sort of make sure this is the correct length, maybe flatten it out a little bit of jiggery pokery to get it to the correct dimensions. And once I've done that, I can then take this back to Jeff the welder's place yet again. Luckily it's only about a mile away from me, so it's not a great problem. And then he can weld these two halves onto this main part of the fairing like that, so it look a bit like that. So yeah, it's all going quite well. Also when I was there, Jeff folded this flat piece of aluminium sheet. He folded it into, as you can see, a 90-degree angle. And the reason for that is because when I cut it down, let's say it's about that long, I'll cut it like that. Half of it will be welded to the ends of this aluminium rod, like so. So it's sticking out about there. I'll then cut off 1/2 of this fold, so it just projects out with a flat piece. And that flat piece I'm going to drill, put a hole in it, which will hopefully align with the holes in the cockpit fairing, and that's the way we'll fasten the bracketry to the cockpit fairing. Well, that's the plan anyway. So yeah, it's all going okay. It's a very slow process, very careful process, and no doubt I'll be making a lot of trips back into Jeff's workshop in the next few days, but that's okay. You know, it's better to take your time and get it right instead of just rushing and getting something wrong and it doesn't fit on the bike or something goes wrong. And now I'm just back from yet another trip to see Jeff the welder, where he finished making this aluminium bracket for the cockpit fairing, as you can see, and I'm really happy with the result. So at some point in the future I'll have this bracket either powder coated, painted or hard anodized, but that can wait for another day. So now I've got to make a new pair of headlamp brackets so I can mount the headlamp and indicators in the correct position to go with this cockpit fairing. And now here we have one of the original headlamp brackets that were on the bike, and below it we've got the two new brackets I'm currently making. As you can see, it's quite a difference in size, and the reason for that is because I've now got to mount the indicators higher up on the bike in this hole here than they were originally, and so they look okay with the cockpit fairing in place. And next, I'm not sure if the camera can pick up the lines that I've now scribed onto the surface of this plate, but these lines here are the lines that I'll be working to and will be the final shape of the brackets. And to help me, I've bolted up some really big washers here, and that's so that I can get the correct curve as I go around these various holes. So here, for example, I've got a curve here parallel with the hole, and I did that by using the original plate, just like that, and I can scribe around it. So that's the way I get a decent line that's concentric with the centre of the holes. So next I'm going to carry on hacksawing away and filing away until I get the shape I want. And next, as you can see, I've now painted and fitted the new headlamp brackets. And so now let's get the fairing and see how it looks on the bike. And now here's the fairing mounted, and it looks pretty good, but the job isn't finished yet, because I've still got two more things to do before this fairing is fully mounted. And the first job is to mount the indicators. And so the whole point of making a new headlamp bracket was to move the mount for the indicator higher up in comparison to the cockpit fairing, so that the indicator is in the middle of this curve, because before it wasn't. But now my problem is it doesn't stick out far enough. As you can see, about half of the indicator lens is inside the cockpit fairing, which is no good. So what I've got to do is find a way of mounting this indicator further out, sort of like that. Maybe a good, I don't know, 30 millimeters further out. And so, since I can't remove this threaded stud in here, because by doing so I'll probably destroy the body of the indicator, I've got to come up with a different idea. So my different idea will be to make a pair of spacers, like so, about 35 millimeters in length. They'll be line drilled all the way through to take an M6 thread all the way through. I'll then screw in the indicator into one end of the spacer, like that. But the thread will only go about halfway into this spacer because it's quite long. So in the other side of this threaded hole, I'll thread in a 6mm stud. A 6mm stud that'll be Loctited into place so it can't go anywhere. It'll be this stud then that will go into the new headlamp bracket and secure the whole thing to the bike. Well, that's the plan anyway. So what I didn't want to do is make something that was a bit of an eyesore that looked wrong on the bike, but I'm pretty sure this should look okay, particularly when I've got the parts hard anodized or powder coated or painted. Right now the new parts on the bike are just been painted just to get the thing to look okay, but in the future, when I get round to dropping out the forks to change the seals, I will get the whole front end, as I say, either hard anodized or powder coated or some clever sort of hard wearing finish, because I don't think this the painting at the moment will last too long in use. So yeah, that's the plan. So I had a look in my little box of spacers. I've got quite a few spacers here, aluminium and steel and stainless steel, as you can see, but I've got nothing that's suitable. However, I had a look round in my little collection of material over there, and I found this. This is a length of 20mm alloy bar, solid bar, and this is just right for what I need to make the two spacers. So what I'm going to do is cut off a length of this stuff, and I need to line drill it and tap it and put a thread all the way through, two pieces. Now my hand drilling skills aren't good enough to drill an accurate hole all the way through something like this. So once I've cut it to the right size, I've got to take it over to Jeff's workshop where he can put it on his lathe and drill a nice accurate hole all the way through it, and then we can thread it and hopefully it'll look okay when it's on the bike. Well, that's the plan anyway, so that'll have to wait until I go and see Jeff in a few days' time. So that's the first task I've got to do with the bike, but what about the second? Well, if you look below the headlamp, you can see a tab here which has been mounted to the base of the aluminium bracket which secures the fairing to the bike, and that tab needs to be secured to the lower yoke somehow. And so the easiest option is to simply drill and tap a hole into my lower fork yoke, which I really don't want to do, and so I've got to come up with a different option. And so instead I want to make a bracket that's secured to the lower yoke by these bolts here, which act as lock stops going into the lower yoke. So it'll be a kind of C-shaped bracket that will go from one side to the other, and in the middle I'll secure this tab at the lower part of the aluminium cockpit fairing, and hopefully that should be pretty secure. So now we need to get at this lower tab, which means removing the fairing but leaving behind its mount. So here goes. Let's pull off now. Come on. There we go. So now I can see what's going on down here. And so, having taken those measurements and with a bit of CAD, cardboard eddy design, I've made this little cardboard template, and it's going to fit something like that. It'll bolt to the yokes using these lock stops and then project forward to meet up with this tab on the aluminium fairing bracket. I will, however, have to raise it up by about 10 millimeters using some spacers so it clears this welded on tab here, which is welded to the headstock, but that's okay. So now I've got to convert this into an aluminium piece. Right, well, as you can see, the basic shape is starting to come together, but I've still got an awful lot more filing to go. And so here's the bracket I've been making. It's not quite finished yet, but we are getting there. So it will be secured to the lower yoke by being bolted to the lock stop bolts like this. And as you can see, it projects forward. So this bit here, which projects forward, needs to be bent down to match the angle of this tab on the aluminium fairing bracket. Once I'm happy with the way it looks, I'm then going to, rather than drill a hole in this thing or several holes, I'm going to drill a slot in it. That way, when I've got it all bolted up, I can alter the angle of the fairing like that, because it can go back and two, and also alter the angle of the headlamp, because that's also important, because you've got to get the direction of the beam correct. So yeah, that's how things are going so far. Now, I also need to make a pair of spacers like this one here. This one isn't actually quite right, but Jeff's now making me a new pair of spacers, and they'll sit underneath these bolts because this bracket needs to sit about 10 mil higher than the top of the yoke, because it needs to clear this this tab which is welded to the front of the headstock. And now I really can't do much more work in fitting the cockpit fairing, because I'm now waiting for new fasteners to arrive from eBay that I've ordered, along with the spacers I need that Jeff's making for me in the next few days. So I think that's about it for this week. I was hoping to get a lot more done, but this aluminium fairing bracket took a lot more work and time than I first imagined. But lesson learned. If I've ever got to make another one, I'll definitely not make it in aluminium, and instead I'll just make it out of mild steel. I think that would be an awful lot quicker and a lot easier. So in part 3 then, we'll carry on with the work and finish off the work to mount the cockpit fairing. And also I've got to address a problem I've got at the back of the bike with the ducktail. But we'll cover that in part 3. So for now then, thanks for watching and cheers.